In this episode, is it moronic? Or is it inspired? Some modern buildings are making us queasy. Welcome to Two Architects and a Lawyer. Join architect Luis de Miguel in Valencia and architect lawyer William McLean in Vancouver for observations and commentary on all things design. Here are William and Luis.
Well, good afternoon, William. How are you doing this fine day?
I'm doing just fine. I'm imagining you sitting by your pool. It looks like a bit of a cloudy day, which must be unusual for you in Valencia.
Well, it was overcast all day and perfect for taping video. And then, of course, now that we're sitting down and actually taping, the sun came out, and God knows what's going to do with his face. So, anyhow, today I think we're doing a topic that could be of some interest to people. It has to do with the fact that human activity has been surrounded by jargon, by lingo, by words that, and particularly architecture now is just. I remember when tectonic came up at some point, and of course nobody knew what it was, but you couldn't really argue about it. You couldn't say, well, the emperor has no clothes, because then you were an ignorant. And an architect can be a lot of things, but you can't appear to be an ignorant. You have to appear to be extremely intelligent and know about all human endeavor and so on. And architectural critics need to show an extraordinary command of the language and be extremely pompous and sort of pretentious and so on. There's an architect in Chile named Daniela Monsalvez, who came up with something that in English translates roughly as archi-moronic. And that describes how we've all kind of evolved into archi-morons, architecturally speaking. And not just in terms of language, but in terms of describing spaces and describing cityscape and, the fabric of the city. And there's all this mumbo jumbo. There is one building that says, according to the person that put up this thing in Instagram, is this building even real? I mean, I don't think anybody's ever asked that of a building. Does this actually exist? I mean, in the old days, you took a picture of something. I mean, nobody would ever say, is this a real building? And yet, here it is. I think it would be good to have a photograph of the structure of this contraption. I mean, the shapes obviously make no sense whatsoever. When we were in school, architecture was extremely simple. You had a couple of posts, you put a beam, do a roof, and call it a day. That was it. That was the build. And then there was a guy named John Portman in Atlanta, of all places, who designed the Hyatt Hotel building on Peach Street. Everything in Atlanta, by the way, is about peaches. So he designed this building, which was amazing because it had a 21-story atrium in its center. Not only was it empty, but the corridors, typically a hotel, of course, is you have a corridor, you have rooms on either side. It's called a double-loaded corridor. And he designed something that was a single-loaded corridor overlooking this atrium. Somehow he convinced the developer that this was the way to go. And this was in 1967 or so, thereabouts. And it was a huge revolution. So it got me thinking, well, how many of these revolutions have we witnessed in the last 40 or 50 years? And I don't know if in your other profession of being a lawyer, is there a parallel to this?
Well, before I get into that, let's just go back to that hotel, which I agree with you was a tremendous innovation, or it seemed to be. It made a great impact on us. Looking back on it, it seems such a mild change to a pretty standard building type, and yet that one gesture of this atrium really caught our imaginations. But what else was going on in those years? We were transfixed by magazines, Louis. Progressive Architecture, Architectural Record were the two Bibles that came out. We were lucky as students to get our hands on one. I don't know where they came from. I guess somebody would have one, or we'd see it in the library. And I can't be sure, but I'm guessing that Portman building in Atlanta was in one of those magazines. And if you're a magazine publisher, it's your job to manufacture innovation, grab attention. You don't show the banal; you show the thing that's unusual. And as a consumer, you're very affected by that. So we're
Absolutely.
not in that culture anymore. There isn't a single source that we go to and come to a collective understanding of what is currently the biggest, the best, the newest, and so on. We get snatches of this through the internet, but we're not all on the same channel at the same time. That's a chief difference.
I think the impact of the Hyatt building on all of us and on architects, practicing architects, lasted for quite a while, years,
Yeah.
decades perhaps.
Mhm.
And the thing is that now everything with the internet is a 2 minute. If you're lucky, you last 2 minutes. So you have to be constantly more outrageous all the time.
That's the very thing that's driving this archi-moronic architecture that you've brought up. It is that urge to stand out, to distinguish yourself. And as people's attention spans get shorter and shorter, you have to do it in more and more outrageous ways. And we're becoming expectant to see that kind of change. And once you've seen it once, you don't want to see it again. You want to see the next big thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And to me, stupidity is something that seems to have permeated all of society in all of its aspects. Now, clearly, every time I say something like this, I sound like the old codger that I am. But I think there's some truth in this nonsense. So, what makes it moronic? Well, it makes it moronic in the sense that there are buildings now that really make no sense. We went to a place called McGill University School of Architecture. And so we came out of there, and one or two people that came out of that school, one you know very well is Arthur Erickson. And Arthur Erickson designed this Museum of Anthropology, which is absolute poetry. And Moses Safdie designed Habitat. I mean, there were really groundbreaking buildings without all the gymnastics. I think there are people lately, this big guy, Scandinavian, has done a building in Manhattan, which is, I
You're
mean,
referring to Bjarke Ingels.
yes, but it frankly, it's hard to look. I mean, it really is painful to look at. And that's one thing that doesn't happen often with architecture. You can get music that is painful to listen to, and you can clearly inflict pain with a hammer and with an implement. But graphic arts or art in general doesn't really. I mean, it can be gory, it can be scary, and so on, but it's not painful. Well, this building is a bit painful to look at, and I can't even begin to imagine what's it like to be there.
Try to describe to me why looking at that is causing you pain. What are you reacting to?
Because it first of all, I don't understand how it stands up. What happens is one of the facades is completely banal, and it's just the other one, and there's a hole in there, and there's probably a very nice garden eventually. I don't know. It just makes me queasy. Queasy. I love that word. Queasy. There's a lovely shot of all of Manhattan, and you see Central Park and so on, and the West River, and
Yes.
the all the buildings. And then all of a sudden there's this thing here. And then it becomes much more clear to understand and why.
I'm looking at that very nice aerial shot of Manhattan with Central
Yeah,
Park, the fabulous Central Park, which
well, if it weren't for Central Park, you wouldn't know what it is.
yeah, and this building, the mass of it seems to be quite overwhelming. The Bjarke Ingels one. But what strikes me looking at this picture is that I have not seen this image repeatedly on TV shows and so on. It has not become a symbol of New York in the way that the Shard and the pickle, the gherkin, are in London, for example. There isn't a TV show you can turn on that takes place in London that does not contrive to show you those two
Yeah.
buildings, preferably in the same frame. In the same way that if you've got something going on in Paris, you've got to work the Eiffel Tower in there somehow. But this one is not symbolic of New York. And in fact, it seems like a very foreign organism.
It is a foreign order. But I think in New York, New York really is different.
My own experience walking in Manhattan, you take for granted that your normal eye level is straight out to the horizon, and you know that in New York there's lots going on above that level. You don't necessarily walk around with your head cranked upwards. You're aware of that canyon effect, and therefore the thing that strikes you as you're walking around are the things that are happening at street level. The fabulous pocket parks, and the unusual and scarce low-rise buildings. The Newark Public Library, the Metropolitan Museum, the smaller scale buildings, because of their rarity, are the things that seem to strike your imagination.
You can design any horrendous piece of work in New York and it'll disappear. It just disappears in that sea of concrete and glass.
But I want to get to the building by Bjarke Ingels, the one in Vancouver, which is called Vancouver House. It's very artfully inserted in a very, very complex site. There is a cloverleaf entrance to the Granville Bridge in Vancouver, a site that no reasonable person could think that you could build on in any way, shape, or form. Engels looked at that site and decided that this building could be shoehorned into it. The other concern that he had to deal with was the requirement by the city that these apartment units not have a direct overlook of traffic on the bridge, which is adjacent. So that caused this carve out of the building up to a particular height beyond which it was considered that this proximity to the traffic was no longer an issue. So that's what produced this curving line on one side of the building.
Uh-huh.
The deeply inset balconies are addressing the same problem. There is noise, tremendous noise from this bridge. And one of the ways that the architect has dealt with that is to, rather than stick the balconies and on the outside of the building and bring the living space windows right out flush with the building, he's deeply recessed them, which provides some acoustical privacy. So what I'm getting to is that unlike some moronic buildings, there are explicable reasons why each choice has been made to cause this building to take its final form. And one could consider it to be quite a respectful, innovative response to some very difficult real problems.
Well, many people seem to think that somehow architects love to, design freely, as it were. These fancy, frivolous structures and so on. And it's completely the opposite. I mean, it's almost impossible to say to give somebody a piece of land and say, design anything you want. It's practically impossible for the architect to do this. It's not like a canvas. You need some requirements. You need zoning. I mean, it may sound crazy, but you do need setbacks. You need some guides, the neighbors and so on, to begin to design something. And I'm glad you brought it up with this building that looks like some whimsy. Many buildings are the shape they are because the architect took count of the streets and so on.
I think in that office, like many starchitects' offices, the principal is the guy who comes up with the idea, perhaps on the back of a napkin or on an airplane visit to a new client. He thinks about the problem and sketches an idea, which is then communicated to his crew back in the office, and they beaver away trying to be as faithful as possible. And once you get started on that process, I mean, you must remember this from your own design career where you get an idea and you hang on to it like a dog with a bone and you try to perfect the idea without moving away from it. If you're a good designer, I think you pursue things down a particular alley. If you discover it's a blind alley, you're smart enough to turn around and come back, start over again. But often with these moronic buildings, and I'll share your view of them, I think that there's a determination to bust through the end of that blind alley and keep going and make sure that the final product is as much like that napkin drawing as it can possibly be. There's no constraint, and there's no reason to be constrained because the technology is there to assist you.
Absolutely. There's always some engineer in the world that can resolve this problem you've created. And these other buildings in New York, I mean, New York is unbelievable. They've got these these buildings that are, I don't know, 10 by 10 feet and 4,000 feet up in the air. I mean, what's up with that? I mean, really, that also makes you nervous. And if it doesn't make you nervous, you don't know anything about structural design. I mean, the amount of steel in that thing must be beyond belief to hold this up. I can't imagine what happens when there's a bit of a breeze, let alone a hurricane.
They're not necessarily all that tall. You know, they're not over
No,
100 stories. They may be 80 stories or something like that. But they
no.
tend to be clustered around Central Park because that's where the most available condo property is. They're as tall as they are because the developer bought up air rights from surrounding properties and piled them onto his own property. But one of the objections to them is the very aggressive shadows that they cast because they stick out from the surrounding buildings, and it's a menacing shadow cast across Central Park, which is a kind of a hallowed territory for locals. I think that the idea of pencil tower came from other places, came from Hong Kong and perhaps other places. Even Australia has a few of them, but New York has the world's skinniest ones. And the way that's measured is by the slenderness ratio. We start perceiving buildings as being slender when it's 1 to 10 or 1 to 12. But 1 to 24 is the ratio at the West 57th building. And it's about 60 feet wide at its base. There's, one condo per floor, and most of them are uninhabited. They're sitting there. They might as well be safety deposit boxes, place to safely park money and walk away from. There's no actual need to occupy them in any kind of permanent way. If you look at the floor plan, it's really remarkable that this could be considered to be a sensible thing to do. The size of these units is unbelievable. But with respect to how do they stand up? Yes, the engineers turn headstands to do this. There are dampers in these buildings, massive counterweights made out of steel, often hundreds of tons of steel, or they're liquid tanks sloshing around near the top of the tower. If you look at the buildings, you see that there are missing windows every few floors. This is because the howling winds have to pass through them rather than exert force on them. So,
Right. No, I mean, clearly they've thought about it. I mean, the architects may produce moronic buildings, but I don't think they themselves are moronic. And certainly engineers, I've never met a moronic engineer. I've met engineers that were awkward in a social setting, but they knew their I-beams and their moments of inertia. I just want to talk about another building that may appear to be moronic, but it's not. Is a building in Montreal, and it's where the NFB is now housed, and it's called the Balmoral, and designed by Provencher Roy. And it's a very simple cube building with a huge gash, and almost like blood pours out. This fire engine red sticking out of the thing, and there's an atrium in there. Well, that I happen to have been at. The atrium looks amazing in the photographs. And the building, frankly, I think it's damn good. And it's unusual, and it calls your attention, makes you think. I admire that building and the guts of these people to do this. And it's very understandable when you look at the picture from above, you see how the thing actually works. And I find it exquisite, but it's almost borderline moron.
one thing you have to say in looking at this building and why perhaps it doesn't come across as being moronic is knowing that it's headquarters for a cultural institution, the National Film Board. I mean, they're an innovative tenant. And I'm sure the architect was responding to that challenge. So the building itself, I think, goes with the tenant. In Vancouver, moving back to Vancouver, there is no regulation about shadow, as far as I know, but there are regulations about preserving views. And one of Vancouver's great features are the views that you can snatch of the North Shore Mountains from various places because the city is hilly. And every once in a while, you come around the corner and look down and across Burrard Inlet to see the snow-capped mountains on the North Shore. It's really quite remarkable. So at one point in the 70s, there were a whole elaborate series of view cones prescribed by the city, which could not be encroached into. Sadly, that's now falling away. But just moving to another strange looking building in Vancouver, can I just take you to the one? It's called the Alberni. It's by Kengo Kuma. And it shares something in common with the Bjarke Ingel Vancouver house that we were looking at a minute ago, in that it has a very strange, carved out, twisting looking form. But the primary reason for that carve out in the picture on the screen at the moment is to allow that view cone to be unaffected, which is coming from some major intersection at probably a kilometer away. Mm-hmm. So that's a very real outcome of this zoning. We haven't really explored your thesis completely about the moronic response to that some architects seem to have to their commission. And I want to take us to Toronto, to the Royal Ontario Museum, and the Crystal, the addition to the neo-Romanesque Royal Ontario Museum. It's by Daniel Libeskind. Picture of it on the screen at the moment. How the heck did this get done?
Well, I don't know, William. There's a committee, and there was was there a competition for it? There has to be one. No?
I don't know, but what there was a sketch on the back of a napkin on an airplane. I can tell you that. And a very powerful presentation to the building committee at the museum by Daniel Libeskind, who at the time it was being pitched and presented, he had in mind something which was, as the name suggests, entirely crystalline in nature. It was all glass. He quickly discovered it couldn't be done in glass because of the climate, because of the structural necessities. So instead, what we've got is this facade made of bits and pieces of glass, steel cladding or aluminum cladding, and very little of that original idea of transparency.
William, that describes about 99% of the buildings in the last 30 years. A little bit of glass, a little bit of cladding, a little bit of steel. Pretty soon, you've got a building. It's like it's the old joke about a billion here, a billion there. Pretty soon, you're talking real money. Well, this is the same thing.
Yes.
Like it goes right back to the beginning of the discussion. How, a post here, a post there, you put a beam across, pitch a roof on top, and there's your building. There you go, Mrs. Robinson. How do you like your house?
Well, just back to this museum addition. It's created no end of problems for the museum itself. The gift shop and all the other spaces that are housed in this addition have things like sloping floors, sloping walls. You can't hang museum displays comfortably on a wall that's sloping inward at 60 degrees. In the gift shop, you're admiring something at one end of the counter. By the time you take it to the cash register at the other end of the counter, the counter, which used to be at waist height, is now at shoulder height. Things roll across the floor. They're wasted triangular spots that they can't use for exhibits and so on. The museum has just gone through a multi-million-dollar exercise to correct some of these problems. And I think that the net result is going to be a slight improvement. But it's worth asking why the museum would have been so receptive to this idea. It clearly was under the influence of Bilbao, thinking that this was somehow going to put it on the world map. There'd be a tremendous uptick in attendance, which there was. The first year, I think the attendance went up 40% with people checking this place out. It plummeted after that. But that Bilbao effect of bringing the world to your door was quite a powerful draw to people in charge of museums and institutions who didn't want to miss out. I also don't want to let us wind up without getting back to your question about whether there's a legal world equivalent to what's happening with modern architecture and postmodern architecture and all the things that have followed. I'm sure there have been parallels. One of them is a move away from archaic language. There's a great movement towards plain language in contract drafting and legislative drafting. So that's a difference. But generally, law is still something which takes place in a solemn context. I think architecture used to be. So did fine art, for that matter. There was something majestic and important and different from the everyday about the way those professions operated. And there was a general willingness to give respect to that solemnity. That willingness to respect the solemnity has fallen away, obviously, in architecture. It's fallen away in fine art. It still exists to a very large extent in law.
Yeah.
Lawyers in Canada, when arguing in court, are still wearing robes. That bit of solemnity is not present in the U.S. and some other countries, but it still is in Canada. And there's a tacit understanding that behaving in a particular way is conducive to getting a good result. That used to be the case with architecture.
It's a completely different setup. I mean, architecture is trying to make up its mind whether we want to embrace technology or we just want to leave it for the engineers. And now, of course, you've got a gadget where you just say, well, I want a neoclassical building that looks a bit like the Villa Rotonda in the Veneto. And sure enough, 30 seconds later, here are all the drawings, the sections, the plans, the elevation. And so people are now wondering, just what the hell do we need an architect for?
Well, when you asked about how law fit into this picture, the first thing that came into my mind, I have to say, was, no, there's no change because we're still solving the same human societal problems that have been around since the ancient Roman Code of Justinian. It's the same exact human issues. And I thought, no, wait a minute, isn't that the same with architecture? We've still got the climate to deal with, the basic functions of human living, where you eat, where you cook, where you sleep. All those things are the same. The difference, and you put your finger on it, is the technology that I suppose to a certain extent, attitude. And of course, there's technological differences in law, but we're still solving the same problems. Architects have technological advantages, but they're still theoretically solving the same issues that were solved 2,000 years ago. Yeah. Well, is our general view that architects are misguided? Is it misguidedness that's producing buildings which we're reacting negatively? I mean,
it's not the architect; it's the client. It's the client. The problem is the client. Somehow everybody agrees. Why do things work? Because everybody agrees to them. And this is the stupidization, if there is such a word, of society. We've all become absolute morons. And we all, oh yeah, that's a good idea. And it's just, I don't make me think to tell you that this is a bad idea. I don't want to be bothered. You want to go ahead and do it, go right ahead.
Okay, I'm going to call it for the day. We're going to find another topic for our next episode soon. Glad everybody who's listening to this has been able to join in with our discussion or hear our discussion. And we'll be in touch.